Ladies and gentlemen, just to have a few agreements to start with, there's not going to be many further on. Like Dan, I am in favour of the separation of church and faith, and like Dan, I don't believe in faith. I do believe in God, but I take that to be a separate issue. We can talk about that a little later on. I don't think history is a science. If it is, I would agree with Dan that it's the weakest of the sciences, but I don't think it's a science in the strict sense, but I don't think we're actually going to have to worry about that. I take it that what Dan has given you is what an intelligent amateur historian might say about Jesus. I take it that Dan is intelligent and sincere, but I take it also that he is an amateur historian, and what I'd like to tell you is about what the professionals think on this subject. By the professionals, I mean people with postgraduate qualifications in the language and cultures of Judea, Galilee, the Greco-Roman period generally, and particularly the first century Roman Empire. People who publish in peer-reviewed journals and bring out books in decent university presses and end up on university bibliographies like mine. Historians approach the gospel by way of critical comparison, and Dan is absolutely right that there are discrepancies between the Gospels, and that's what gives the historians the grist for their mill. Looking at those discrepancies between the accounts allows for critical comparison. And the great majority of professional historians dealing with this, and I mean professional historians who are conservative Christians, liberal Christians, not Christians at all, Jews, agnostics, atheists, and even the occasional Calathumpian, come to the basically similar consensus on a number of issues. They argue that Mark's Gospel probably was written first, that both Matthew and Luke's Gospel came later, we don't know in which order. They probably both used Mark, but they also used other things, and that there was a period of oral tradition before the Gospels came to be written, probably starting in the late 60s or early 70s, and probably all being complete by the mid-90s, but those dates are rubbery and we have to allow for a margin of error. Historians may or may not agree on a lot of things, but there are a number of things about the historical Jesus that there is an overwhelming consensus about. The consensus is, for a start, that we know more with historical probability about Jesus' public career than we know about his birth and his childhood. And I would suggest to you that the following 7 or 8 points would be agreed with by the great majority of professional historians writing in this area. Number 1, Jesus believed in the dawning intervention of God in history, which he called the coming of the kingdom of God. This theme runs through all the different strands of the gospel tradition. It's there in miracle stories, it's there in parables, it's there in independent sayings, it's everywhere. And you would really have to work very hard indeed to remove it from the material. Secondly, Jesus believed himself to be in some sense God's ultimate messenger. He said, for example, if I by the finger or spirit, Matthew and Luke, of God cast out demons, then the kingdom has come upon you. In other words, Jesus' own activities were in some sense inaugurating the great change that he believed was happening in his lifetime. His setting up of 12 disciples was a symbolic statement that he was in some sense renewing the nation of Israel in his own mission and person. Jesus believed himself and was believed to do exorcisms and other kinds of miracles. This is everywhere through the gospel accounts. It's there in the material that's only in Mark, it's there in the material that's only in Matthew, it's there in the material that's only in Luke, and it's in material that Matthew and Luke have in common, which they don't get from Mark. It's everywhere. It is, in other words, multiply, independently attested. Not only that, but later Jewish writers, criticising Christianity, argue that Jesus was a sorcerer who had learnt magic and led Israel astray. In other words, they thought Jesus was a miracle worker too, but of the wrong kind. Jesus preached God's undeserved forgiveness and offer of reconciliation. Again, this runs all through the multiple strands of the gospel traditions. He gave forgiveness and offered friendship and fellowship over meals with corrupt public servants and prostitutes, A story which I suggest to you early Christians are highly unlikely to have invented because it doesn't reflect well on the man. Jesus was a critic of the religious establishment of his own day who expected to be killed for his views. For example, he commented, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem that stones the prophets and murders those sent to you, how long I have wished that I could," and then he goes on and says what he wished he could do. I put it to you that this story is highly unlikely to have been invented by the early Christians because it seems to suggest that Jesus expected he would be stoned, whereas it is fairly well established that that's not how he finished up. Jesus believed his death would have something to do with God's redeeming activity. In Christian terms, he thought his death would be a sacrifice for sins. This comes up again in multiple strands of the gospel materials. And finally, Jesus believed that his own mission was primarily to the people of Israel. But, and this I think is less certain, but nonetheless reasonably so, at a later stage, his work would be carried out to a wider world. Now note, please, the methods that historians use to reach these conclusions do not require Christian belief. They are methods accepted by scholars who are conservative Christians, liberal Christians, Jews, agnostics and atheists. These conclusions do not necessitate Christian belief, but these conclusions are consistent with Christian belief. I suggest to you they're a good place to start for further discussion. They're a far more mainstream place to start than the mythological Jesus view, about which I'll have a great deal to say later, which is held by barely any historian who is not a militant atheist at the same time. The real historians, the ones with the postgraduate qualifications, the ones who publish in peer-reviewed journals, overwhelmingly believe that Jesus was a real person of the kind defined above. It is therefore, it seems to me, on Dan Barker's side, up to him to explain why that great consensus of scholarship should not be taken more seriously.